Hello, everyone. And I'd like to thank eFuture for giving me another opportunity to present one of these webinars for you today. In the one that I gave last year, I talked in general terms about language testing and assessment. And I talked a little bit about speaking assessment, but this time I was asked to focus much more on how to assess learners' speaking ability. So that's the focus of my session today. Okay, here we go. Okay, so here's an outline of what I'll be talking about today. So I'll review some of the key concepts that I discussed in the last webinar about language assessment in general, and then I'll go on to cover these 4 aspects that are outlined on the screen there. So we'll work through those in sequence. Now, first of all, so review of some key concepts. First of all, what do we mean by the term language assessment? And I gave this definition. I've modified it slightly, but this is how I define language assessment: the process of finding out what our students have learned or what their language ability is in order to make decisions for various educational purposes. And I'll talk about what those purposes are in a moment. But it's important to understand that when I talk about assessment, it covers both formal tests and examinations, but also a range of other procedures that teachers can use in the classroom and in their school setting in order to find out what progress their learners are making and what they've achieved in terms of their language learning goals. Now, why assess our students? So here we're focusing on the purposes of assessment. And last time I distinguished these 3 phases of assessment, if you like. So first of all, at the start of a course or at the beginning of a school year, there's maybe a role for initial assessment to place students in classes and diagnose their existing ability in the language. I won't really be talking about that today. But then while the course or the school year is going on, we have formative assessment activities of this kind. And these are the ones fundamentally that teachers will be engaged in the classroom context. So I'll be talking quite a lot about that today, what's involved in that kind of assessment, but also about designing assessments for these kinds of summative purposes. So measuring their achievement, to what extent have they reached the goals in the curriculum, assessing their level of proficiency, what can they do in the language from a communicative perspective. And summative assessment is also important for external reporting purposes. I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. Now, I used this diagram last time to talk about features of good assessments in general, and the most important feature is that any assessment should be valid. That's kind of the umbrella term that we use. So a test is valid to the extent that it provides good information about what students have learned, what they know in the language, and provides us with a basis of making the appropriate decisions about them in terms of those purposes I just identified for formative or summative types of assessment. Now, I spent some time talking about each of these features in the last talk. I won't do that again because if you're interested, you can go back to my previous webinar on YouTube. But just basically, particularly for younger learners, we need to make sure our assessments are appropriate for their age level. Obviously, practicality is important. Reliability is something I'll focus quite a lot on later on in this talk. And also, we like to think that all assessments are valid in terms of promoting good learning, breaking down a barrier that we often see between teaching and assessment, or teaching and exams. And we also want to get valid results from any kind of assessment procedure that we use. But let's focus more on the features of good oral assessments. First of all, I emphasized in my last talk the fact that speaking is quite a stressful activity. It's the most public kind of language skill. And even for me, in presenting this webinar, I've been a bit nervous, and it's a bit of a strain for me to be able to talk to you like this, but also obviously for people who are much less competent in the language than I am. And there are also personality differences here. So it's important, if we want learners to be able to speak and to give their best performance, to create this kind of environment for any kind of assessment. Also, we need to engage their interest in the kind of tasks and topics that we ask them to speak about. We can always speak much better about things that are within our own areas of knowledge. Another aspect, and this relates to reliability, is being able to have multiple samples of speech in different contexts. And I'll talk more about how we can do this within a formal testing situation later on. But this is one advantage of the teacher in the classroom. If you're working with students many hours a week over a course, you have many opportunities to observe how well they can perform various tasks. So that's an important element of a good oral assessment, which contributes to the next point, having a reliable measure of their performance. And I promise I will get back to that later on in the talk to discuss what we mean by reliability, because there are particular issues related to reliability of speaking assessments that we need to pay some attention to. So, so on the basis of samples of the learner's speaking performance, we need to make good judgments, good decisions about what they've achieved and what maybe further development they need in different aspects of the study of the language. So on that basis, ideally, if we have assessments that have all of these features, we can make well-supported decisions about our students in relation to their current speaking ability and maybe their future potential as well. So now let me go on to focus on informal assessment in the classroom context. I'm just checking my time here. Yeah, I'm ahead of time, so that's good to give you time to ask, or for me to answer the questions that you may have at the end of the webinar. So in terms of informal assessment in the classroom context, we can distinguish what I'm calling teacher-led activities, where the teacher is in the front of the class and talking to all of the students together. And another context in which assessment is possible is where the students are working in pairs or in small group contexts. So the kind of purposes for assessment for which this sort of activity is appropriate are for progress, for evaluating whether students are working towards their goals in terms of speaking skills in English. We can also diagnose those who are not performing so well, who may need extra assistance or practice with pronunciation perhaps, or with asking questions or other aspects of speaking ability in the language. And also, these kind of activities provide opportunities for the teacher to give feedback to the students to identify what they're doing well, but also areas where they need to improve. So by teacher-led activities, I mean the sort of things that are illustrated in the pictures here. So a common activity, maybe particularly with younger learners, is the teacher reads a story to the class and holds up the book so the students can see the story and see the pictures. For older learners, it may be a reading passage that is read aloud as the basis for discussion. And with this kind of activity, there are many opportunities for the teacher to ask questions about the story, maybe about particular words that the students may or may not know that occur in the story or that are related to the topic that the teacher is reading about. And teacher and students can also work together. Once the teacher has read the story or read the passage once or twice, the teacher can lead a discussion, and maybe they can work on well, I guess it's a blackboard in this picture, but more commonly, maybe these days, a whiteboard, where they can record the key elements in the story. So that gives the teacher a lot of opportunities to interact with the students, to encourage them to talk, and for the teacher informally to observe how well individuals in the class can perform in that situation, in answering questions and contributing to the discussion. But there are other kinds of activities also that I've indicated here, discussing experiences and ideas, and the teacher introducing a new topic, a new theme, a new project. So all of these contexts provide opportunities for the teachers to encourage students to talk, particularly by asking good questions. And what I mean by good questions, first of all, avoiding yes-no questions, questions that can just be answered simply yes or no, or with one or two word answers. So particularly as learners progress in their proficiency and they're capable of speaking at greater length, then we need to think about the kinds of questions that we ask that may encourage them to give more extended answers, to explain why, where, how, to ask those kind of questions rather than ones that just elicit very simple kinds of answers. And part of that too, again, as learners develop in their proficiency, is that we want learners to think, to use their reasoning powers through the second language. Good kinds of questions or discussion points are ones where there's more than one possible answer. So the teacher doesn't necessarily accept the first answer that one student gives, but allows a number of students to respond to the questions that are given. Another important element here is what we call wait time. So teachers are not only guilty of talking too much in the classroom rather than giving their students a chance to talk, but also when we ask a question, often if there's no immediate answer, we feel we have to fill in the silence. So that's one thing that I've learned in discussions with students who are adult learners, but the same applies to younger ones as well, to have a pause, to be comfortable with maybe a few seconds to allow the students to think about answers and to give them time to compose those answers in English. So we shouldn't always be expecting students to answer questions right away. And one way to give them extra thinking time is, once you ask a question, to ask them to talk about it in pairs, maybe in their first language or in English, and then the teacher asks the students to answer the questions in various ways. So these are other ways within normal classroom environments that the teacher can elicit good samples of the students' speaking ability. So that was the first context where the teacher is working with the whole class. Obviously, if you do a lot of peer work or group work with the kind of activities that I've listed on the screen here in a communicative type classroom, then you have a situation where, well, not only can the teacher go around and observe the students, listen to them as they're performing the task in their pairs or their small groups, but there can be a later phase where the groups or the pairs report back to the whole class on the task, the answer that they found to the problems. So whatever the appropriate kind of feedback is to the whole class based on the particular task that they're doing. And then that also gives the teacher opportunity to give feedback to the students, which is a significant part of formative assessment procedures as we currently understand them. So, looking at this situation a little further, so here are two typical situations of teachers in the class where the students are working in small groups. we've got a younger group here of children at the primary or elementary level, and somewhat older learners in this case. So if we're thinking about using this situation for informal assessment purposes, there are a number of questions that we can address. First of all, how practical is it for the teacher to move around the classroom? It seems in these two classrooms there is space in between the groups for the teacher to move around. One thing that can happen in my experience certainly is that when you join a particular group, the students all fall silent. So that can be a problem. So you need to maybe sit down and encourage them to keep talking. If you observe that one or two students in the class are not saying anything, maybe you can sit and encourage them to say something, ask them a relevant question to get them contributing. One thing that I like to do in this context is to have my own chair so that I can move around and sit with each group. So I'm more or less at their level rather than standing above them as these two teachers are doing. So sitting either within the group here or maybe just beside the group is a way for the teacher to unobtrusively listen and observe how the students are speaking and performing the tasks. We also need to think in this context about how we form groups. In this situation, typically some students will be much more confident about speaking because of their personality or because of their they have more proficiency in English. We need to try to avoid a situation where they always dominate the discussion, and maybe we need to move students around in different groupings in order to help control that problem. Also thinking about how pairs and groups are formed in the first place. So is it good to have students working with a friend or with someone next to them, or is it good to put them together with other students sometimes that they're not so familiar with and for whom it may be more challenging for them to speak? So there are those sorts of issues that are involved in setting up the classroom for this kind of informal observation, which of course involves not only teaching considerations, but also here we're focused on what's involved in having opportunities to assess the students' ability. Now, there are differences of opinion here. Some scholars say that both with teacher-led activities and with teachers monitoring students as they engage in peer work or group work, that in itself is an assessment activity. So while the teacher is listening to the students, asking them questions and answering it and observing how they perform, then this is assessment activity. There's a recent development in assessment called learning-oriented assessment. And those scholars who follow that approach argue that almost everything that the teacher does in the classroom in working with language students can be seen as assessment. I prefer to think that if it's to be assessment, then recording individual students' performance is quite important. Some teachers do this just by making so-called mental notes. So if you have an opportunity to work with a class of students for an extended period over a whole course for many hours a week, then obviously you build up knowledge of those students and what their strengths and weaknesses are in speaking, along with the other areas of language ability. But many teachers find it helpful to write notes, or I've also seen the term anecdotal records kept, where the teacher has a notebook, or maybe these days has a note app on their phone and can make informal notes about individual students' performance that can be used for reporting purposes later. Sometimes it's good maybe to choose a certain number of students, maybe 5 or 6 in the class, and observe them and take notes on them for 1 week, and then the next week to take notes on another group of students. So in that way, the teacher can more systematically keep records of how the students perform in terms of speaking ability, and maybe also other areas that can be observed, their writing skills, and so on. Another instrument that can be used for this purpose, another useful tool, may be a checklist with a list of the students' names and maybe a simple observation of whether each student participated or did not participate in a particular activity. So that can give an indication of which students the teacher needs to work with a bit more closely to find out why they're not participating. So is it because of a personality thing, that some people are naturally much quieter than others? But it could be also that a particular student is not contributing because they're really struggling in terms of their speaking ability. So keeping a systematic record of student participation can be helpful from that point of view. If you can identify particular speaking skills or speaking objectives that you're working on, then a checklist could also simply record whether each student has achieved that objective satisfactorily or not. Something a little more elaborate beyond a checklist is a rating sheet where we can identify simple criteria, simple aspects of speaking ability that we want to observe, such as these ones: pronunciation, fluency, grammar, vocabulary, and then the teacher can record maybe a 1, 2, or 3, depending on whether the student is still developing in that area of speaking ability, whether they can perform satisfactorily or whether they can perform quite well. So in that context, these are different ways, and teachers have different styles of teaching. Some will find one of these methods more appropriate, more suitable to their style or to their working style than others do. But those are some ideas that you can use within that kind of informal classroom context in order to make records of student performance, and on that basis be able to report to parents and maybe contribute to more summative assessments at the end of the course or the end of the school year. Okay, now again, I'm checking my time to see where am I, 15? Yeah, okay, I'm doing well in terms of my timing to give you a chance for you to, for me to answer some of your questions at the end. Let's move on to formal speaking tests. So going back to the purposes that I identified earlier, these are more summative purposes for assessment. So achievement focuses more on the curriculum, the learning objectives in the curriculum or the syllabus or the textbook that you're using. So if you give a final exam, a final school exam or class exam for your course, then you design that test in relation to the curriculum or the textbook, whatever teaching plan you've been following. Proficiency is a more general kind of assessment. Often it's done by means of, let's say, an international test like the Cambridge exams or TOEFL. And that has a focus, a more general focus, not on a particular curriculum, but on more general kinds of skills that learners can use for communicative purposes outside of the classroom. Formal speaking tests are also important for external reporting. If you need to report results for your students, say grades or marks for students, to the school principal or director or school administration, or maybe on a higher level, if you're in the public system, reporting to the Ministry of Education or to another education authority like that. So that gives formal speaking tests the basis for more important decisions about learners, and so we say there are higher stakes involved in that kind of assessment. So those kinds of assessment need to be designed more carefully. Now, one thing we need to take into account in designing assessments and deciding how we're going to assess students is this complexity of spoken language. there are so many aspects of speaking that potentially we can pay attention to, particularly as learners become more advanced in the language. Maybe at elementary level, we have a particular focus on linguistic elements like vocabulary, grammar, pronunciation, and perhaps to some extent what I'm calling here speech quality. So stress, intonation patterns, distinguishing statements from questions, for example, and also fluency, being able to speak without pausing, without hesitating to try to think, what's that word again? Or how can I say this grammatically? So I guess we value fluency as being an important aspect of speaking. But there are these other elements as well, what I call discourse, and I use narrative sequence as a fancy term for storytelling, telling a good story. If you're giving a talk on a particular topic, maybe a recent experience or something that you've studied in a classroom context, then you need to organize the ideas well. Speech functions covers things like introducing yourself, apologizing, asking, making good requests, all those sorts of features of spoken language. Content can also be important. So if learners are given a storytelling task, we expect them to include all of the relevant steps in telling the story. And if they're discussing a particular process, how something is made, then again, they need to not leave out any important information in that process. Presentation skills are important. If learners give a talk to a class or give some other kind of presentation, they need to speak up so everybody can hear them. They need to ideally make eye contact to look at the audience rather than down at their notes or down at the floor, and also use visual aids appropriate, might be a picture or information on the screen and so on. And then maybe most importantly, speaking involves not just one person speaking in a monologue situation, but also interaction, the ability to participate in a conversation or even at a simple level to answer questions in an interview context with a teacher or an examiner. And there are other kinds of interaction as well that we need to engage in. And that brings in listening as well as speaking. So in designing tasks, we have to recognize that, let me go back to that for a moment, that we can't cover all of this. So what I want to go on to now is to look at some particular tasks from the international exams. This is from the TOEFL Junior exams, a read aloud task, which is TOEFL Junior is a computer-based test. So the students see on the screen this particular reading passage. They have the opportunity to read it by themselves and maybe do a little bit of quiet practice, and then they read the passage aloud. So if we look at this particular task, we can say that there's no vocabulary or grammar involved here because that's already given in the reading passage that is on the screen. But what we're assessing with this kind of task is pronunciation of individual words, stress and intonation patterns. So making the first statement into a question, for example, why do people clap their hands? And then what else can we see? A long time ago, clapping meant something very different than it does today. So using that kind of sentence stress to show that you understand the meaning of the passage is something that we can look for as learners perform this kind of task. So that's what's covered by stress and intonation. And also ideally we want to find that they can read the passage quite smoothly without struggling over the pronunciation of particular words. Okay, so that's one example of how we can take particular aspects of speaking and design a task that allows us to assess how good the learners are at those kinds of things. Another common task that we find in the tests and maybe in teaching activities as well, is spot the difference kind of task. This is from the Cambridge Movers test, which is the second level of their young learners exam. And these are fairly simple pictures. In this particular test, the candidates for the test can see both of the pictures. And so they're asked by the examiner to identify what there are actually four differences here. So we've got clouds in the first picture versus sun. We've got a ball here and a boat. The boy is wearing a watch here and not in this case. And then we've got two green bottles in front of the rock here and behind the rock there. So in terms of what's being assessed here, in the first instance, it's vocabulary. So being able to name each of the objects which are different in the two pictures, and also grammar. So being able to say that the bottles are in front of the rock or behind the rock, the ball and the boat are between the whale and the boy, and so on. So there's some simple grammar involved as well as vocabulary in performing that task. Let's look at another task which is at the higher level, the Cambridge Flyers. So first of all, there are some differences here. These are more complicated pictures. There are more people and a number of different activities, number of things that the test candidates can comment on. And the task is also presented differently. So in this case, this picture on the left side is the one that the examiner has, and then the candidate has this picture on the right. So whereas in the earlier test, the candidate could see both pictures, in this case, the candidate can see only the one that we can see here on the right. And the other difference is that for this task, the examiner makes statements like this. In my picture, the toy train is in the box. So then the candidate is expected to say, in my picture, the toy train is outside the box or near the box or in front of the box, something like that. And then another example, in my picture, the girl on the sofa is smaller than the boy. So in this case, the candidate has to say something like, in my picture, the girl is bigger than the boy, or maybe the boy is smaller than the girl. So clearly in this case, there's both vocabulary and grammar involved, and maybe more grammar is required in order to explain the differences, but also there's listening ability. This brings in the interaction element. So for this task, as compared with the previous one, it's also important for the candidate to understand what the examiner says, to know which part of the picture that the examiner is referring to, and also to be able to formulate an appropriate statement that matches to some degree what the examiner has said. Now, okay, I need to move on a bit more quickly. Storytelling tasks. These also are fairly popular. This is one from Cambridge Flyers, where it's called The Brave Teacher, and you can see some students are distracted by a cat that's gone up a tree and got stuck there. So the teacher bravely goes out, climbs the tree, and brings the cat down again. So in this case, vocabulary, grammar, fluency are all involved, and also what I called before narrative sequence, so being able to tell a good story. In this particular task, the examiner gives the models the first part of the story. So Nick and Anne are looking out of the classroom window. The teacher isn't happy because they're not doing work. Now you tell the rest of the story. Now we can compare that with another task, a more advanced one, maybe from TOEFL Junior. Again, this is presented, this is a computer-based test presented on the screen, and it's a story about three young people going to a movie theatre and finding it's almost full, and they have to ask this old gentleman to move so that the three of them can sit together. And then the problem is that the old man has another big man who comes and sits in front of him, so it's a bit awkward for him. So in performing this task, there are all of those elements that I identified in the previous one, but I actually tried out this task myself, and I found that for this task, content is also important, because to tell the story well, you need to fill in some gaps that are not directly shown in the pictures. So whereas in the previous tasks, the Cambridge one, you can more or less tell the story based on what's shown explicitly in the pictures. For this one, you have to kind of fill in the gaps. So the candidates need to add some content for these pictures to show the story, to tell the story well. Okay, now let me move on, looking at the time here. Yeah, I'm doing okay, I think, still. So those are some examples of how we can design speaking tasks in order to elicit different aspects of the learner's speaking ability, vocab, grammar, the ability to tell a good story, and so on. Now, let's go on to what we call the rating process, which is the term that we normally use for marking or scoring speaking or writing tasks. So again, we have some considerations here. As we've just shown, or as I've just shown, speaking performance is fairly complex. If we're assessing learners for summative purposes of the kind that I talked about before, we have to try to be as fair as possible to all candidates. But inevitably, even with fairly simple tasks, the examiners have to use some subjective judgment to decide how well students have performed. And this means that the raters or examiners need to have a good understanding of what the task involves and know what criteria they're supposed to apply in order to award marks or a rating for each student's performance. So that makes training of raters very important, but even with training, experienced raters may make different judgments. So we try to make them agree as much as possible to have a high degree of consistency in the ratings, but it's not possible to have complete agreement except with maybe fairly simple and straightforward tasks. Now, there are two approaches that we can take in rating candidates, and using two kinds of scales. I meant to add the word scale in this case, so holistic scales and analytic scales. So the difference here is that with a holistic scale, there's just a single scale for the raters to use, and they judge more or less on the basis of an overall impression of the candidate's performance. And we can distinguish that from what I call an analytic scale, where the different elements that I've identified in the previous slides, pronunciation, grammar and vocabulary, fluency, and so on, are separated out, and the raters have to give a mark for each individual element. Let me illustrate what I mean by looking at this holistic scale, which comes from the TOEFL primary test, their scoring guide. So notice that for each of the tasks, and there are multiple tasks in the TOEFL primary test, the raters give a score out of 3. So a good performance gets a 3, an okay one gets 2, and a poor one gets 1. But I don't know how well you can read this, but for each level, different elements are defined in these descriptors. So the meaning, grammar and vocabulary, an accurate, complete response in terms of content, intelligibility, which includes pronunciation, and a fluid or fluent delivery. So you can see that various elements that I've previously identified as separate aspects of performance are put together in a single package, a single cluster. And similarly for the other levels on the scale. So this is the approach that's adopted, I think, in all of the TOEFL speaking and writing assessments, this kind of holistic approach where raters are trained to judge in terms of 3, 2, 1, on the assumption that for most candidates, those who perform the task well will show this combination of features, and so on for those at the lower levels. Here's an example of a task to which that particular scale is applied, the task where students are expressing opinions about what kind of animal they like. So while there may be differences in terms of students' pronunciation, fluency, and so on, the raters are trained to apply this 3-point scale to that kind of task. For the Cambridge Young Learners exams, there's not so much information publicly available about the details of how the examiners give marks to students' performance, but it seems they do use an analytic approach. So the examiners are trained to give separate marks for vocabulary and grammar as one cluster, for pronunciation, and for what they call interaction. And I think it's something similar in the Pearson exams as well, that they use separate analytic scales for vocabulary and grammar on the one hand and pronunciation on the other. Another interesting format, which is not found in the Cambridge Young Learners exams, but for the exams for teenagers and older learners, starting at B1 on the Common European Framework. And that's where we have 2 candidates and 2 examiners working through the test together as a group. So the 2 examiners have different roles, which I'll explain in a moment. But this particular format has a 4-part test. First involves an interlocutor answering questions from the examiner for each candidate separately. Then each candidate describes a photo, and the other candidate has the opportunity to ask a question or 2. And then part 3, the 2 candidates work together in an interactive way to solve some kind of problem. And then part 4, there's a general discussion between the interlocutor and the 2 candidates about a particular topic nominated by the examiner. Now, the marking procedures for this format, the 2 examiners have different roles. So the interlocutor, as you just said, is the examiner who conducts the different parts of the test and interacts directly with the candidates. The assessor sits quietly in the room and focuses on assessing the students analytically. So the interlocutor makes just an overall impression judgment called global achievement, whereas the assessor assigns more detailed marks for these 4 components of the performance. So this Cambridge paired oral format in a way offers the best of both worlds. So it gives opportunities for the candidates to interact with the examiner and also with each other, because often students will perform differently when they get to talk to another student as compared to an adult examiner. But also the marking procedures involve both holistic and analytic elements. In terms of the relative advantages of the 2 approaches, holistic scales can work well when in these kind of contexts. So particularly for the TOEFL tests, which tend to have multiple short items making up their speaking tests, and each item may be fairly simple in terms of what's involved in responding to them. And also importantly, TOEFL always uses at least 2 raters for each candidate's performance. But there are other contexts in which analytic scales may be preferable when the task is more complex, when maybe there's only 1 examiner, 1 rater, and where it's important for learners to receive diagnostic feedback. So obviously that's much easier if the examiner is using an analytic scale, and so the learner can receive information about how good their pronunciation was as compared with their vocabulary and grammar, their fluency, and so on. There's one last element, which I won't spend a lot of time on. I'll just put it up on the screen for you to read. So if you're in a situation where you're working with a group of other teachers in your school, you're all teaching the same course but in different classes, and you need to work together to assess maybe a final achievement test for your program, then ideally these would be the kind of steps that you follow in order to train yourselves in order to be able to assess student performance reliably. And certainly if you have the opportunity to be a rater or be an examiner within a program like the Cambridge exams or the TOEFL young or primary learners, then this is the kind of training program that would be involved in order for you to make reliable judgments of the students' performance. Okay, so just summing up what I've said, I'll make these points. First of all, that there are many opportunities for teachers to assess students informally in the class as part of their regular teaching activities for those kinds of formative purposes that I identified earlier, for progress, for diagnosis, for giving feedback. But obviously there are situations where those kinds of assessments need to be complemented by more formal tests and exams. I showed how the tasks that we use in those tests can focus on particular aspects of speaking rather than trying to cover all of the different elements. And the other thing too, which is important for speaking assessment, is especially when we're using, when we're carrying out assessment for summative purposes, that we need to be careful that the subjective judgments that raters or examiners need to make should be guided by well-designed scales and by adequate training. Okay, so that's the end of my talk, and I'll hand back to Gary now so he can run the question part of the session.
All right, so we have a few questions here. If you guys also have any questions as well, feel free to put them in the chat. We have quite a bit of time to answer any questions that you may have. So we had one in the chat earlier. I might need some clarification a little bit from this user. Hopefully they're still here. So it says, how do you assess if I add more individual students to present in about 5 minutes in front of the class and the others listen and make questions? So that it sounds a little bit confusing. So, but I mean, I'm guessing they're wondering about your opinion of having the students present something for 5 minutes and then I guess Q&A as a form of assessment.
Yeah, I know one thing that can happen in this situation is that the students who are just listening get a bit bored, and that can be a problem. So you need to find ways for the students to be engaged. I mean, this is a general problem with speaking assessment, even for formal assessments, that typically students need to be assessed one by one or at the most in small groups. And that means that speaking assessments can take, well, normally do take much longer than, say, writing assessments or assessments of other skills, listening and reading, where a large group of students can all take a test or an assessment together. But yeah, I think if giving presentations is part of the learning objectives, it's appropriate in terms of your teaching goals, then you do want to give learners that opportunity to speak. I guess maybe it's possible to divide them into small groups and give mini presentations within each group. That's one way around this problem. So the teacher can't monitor the student performance so closely as in a situation where the that each student has the opportunity to speak in front of the whole class. But one thing I mentioned in relation to making records of your informal assessment observations is that maybe you don't have to assess all of the students at the same time. So a certain number of students can perform a speaking or presentation task this week, and then others will have a turn later on. So as long as you keep a track of which students have already performed the task, then you can make sure that all of the students have that opportunity, maybe 1, 2, or 3 times during the course. So those are some suggestions in response to that question.
All right, very good. And then we have some more here in the Q&A. One teacher asks, do we need speaking rubrics for formative speaking assessment?
Not necessarily. So some teachers who are very familiar with the learning objectives, have clearly defined objectives, may be able to keep track of those in their heads. But I suggested alternatives would be simple checklists where the teacher keeps a record of how students have performed different tasks. I don't think you need an elaborate scale. I suggested maybe a simple 1, 2, 3 scale, which might indicate in general terms how well each student has performed, and maybe a 1 or a 2 would be a signal to the teacher that you need to potentially give that student some additional assistance or some more opportunities to practice. So, I don't think that it requires an elaborate scale, but just something simple that allows you to keep track of individual students and to have records that may be useful later on for reporting purposes. But a lot of what formative assessment is just, it's not only feedback to the students, but teachers getting feedback and identifying what they need to do to help individual students, as well as maybe in some cases the whole class, to work on developing their speaking skills more.
Okay, very good. We have another one here. Is interaction the most important aspect that teachers should focus on?
I think that depends on our learning objectives. With younger learners, with real young learners who are just learning social skills, it may be that you can only expect a limited amount of interaction from them. So that's where age appropriateness comes in, the level of the students' social and educational and cognitive development. It comes back to really the learning objectives in the curriculum, and also what's in the textbook. So if students are supposed to engage in these kinds of speaking activities, then you have to have opportunities to be able to observe how well they can perform in that kind of interaction. I guess part of what I'm saying in emphasizing interaction is to say, as I mentioned before, teachers tend to do most of the talking in the class situation unless they make a deliberate effort to hold back and to give students opportunities to talk. I guess that varies culturally, the extent to which teachers are comfortable in stepping back and letting the students take the initiative in conducting activities in pairs or small groups. But also, I think the other thing is in terms of formal tests and exams, traditionally it's been very much an interview model that we've used to assess students for their speaking ability in an oral exam. So it's largely the teacher or the examiner asking questions or directing the students to perform certain tasks. So a lot of thinking about how we assess students these days is going into this area of interaction. And there are certainly challenges involved in it to be able to assess students reliably. If we're working in pairs, how do we deal with a situation where one student is dominant and the other student has very little opportunity to talk? That's one of the issues that the Cambridge exams need to face in setting up their paired format that I discussed during my talk. So, yeah, I think we're recognizing that interaction skills are important, and interaction with peers as well as interaction with teachers. And so we need to find ways to design assessment tasks that allow students to demonstrate that they have those kinds of skills. And we also need to have good ways of assessing students. You can think about a small group situation where there are maybe more advanced learners with maybe 4 or 5 students in a group. Then that can be quite challenging, certainly if one examiner or one rater has to rate each student's performance separately.
And we have one more here that just came in. Kind of touched upon a little bit, but is there a role for peer evaluation?
Yeah, I talked about that in the last I left that out, but that's another important element, self-assessment and peer assessment. So in relation to an earlier question about students giving presentations and the problem that I mentioned that some students who are just listening, who are forming the audience for a presentation, may get distracted, particularly if the speaker is not a very good one. You can give the students the task of assessing their peers in that kind of performance and encourage them not to write too negatively about other candidates. So to recognise good aspects of a candidate's performance as compared with poorer ones. But yeah, I think I did mention the idea of making learners more independent in conducting these kind of peer or group work activities by themselves, with the teacher just looking on and providing guidance where necessary. And I think that, there is an important role for learners assessing themselves and also for peers assessing each other in how well they perform their speaking skills. I did actually, I think, give a couple examples of simple self-assessment and peer assessment instruments in my webinar last year. So if you go on YouTube, you can have a look at that and see what kind of tasks. But yeah, I think that self-assessment and peer assessment are an important element in that kind of observation of peer work and group work, as well as individual presentation type performances.
All right, we'll grab one last question, if that's okay here. This person writes, so thank you so much for your presentation. I have a question. In case I use the grading scale, fluency reaches 5, but grammar reaches 2. How can I grade this case? Thank you.
Well, that's a situation where you need an analytic scale. That's the classic argument in favor of an analytic scale, that if we have a holistic scale, we assume that most learners at different levels have the same cluster of features. But I guess we all know learners who are strong in one aspect of speaking, but rather weak in another. So that's certainly a situation where we need to have separate scales, or at least be able to award marks separately according to different aspects of the candidate's performance. And especially if it's a diagnostic situation where we want to give learners feedback on their performance, then that's a situation where you need to give separate marks. And in a formal kind of context, those different elements need to have their own scales.
Okay. All right. So we're going to go ahead and wrap it up there. Thank you very much, Professor Reed. So for everyone, I see a lot of people asking for the presentations. The presentation will be made available. Just kind of go through everything here. So if you contact these people here, We will also be including the presentation in an email later once we get it all settled. And for all the attendees, we do offer certificates and everything for you guys that have taken your time out to join today's webinar. So we do ask that you do contact these people here in your country to get those. We try to make sure that all these certificates are as authentic as possible, so we don't openly make it available to download or anything immediately. So we want to kind of reward all these attendees, all of you that are coming in to for taking their time out to gain this knowledge and learn something to use in your classroom with your students. So if you contact these people here, if you don't see your country on this list, feel free to contact eFuture directly. We do have, at eFuture, we do take in a lot of your feedback. So please fill out the survey. One of my colleagues will be linking that in the chat. We do take in all of the feedback and try to, continually improve our webinars. So if you fill out that survey and let us know how we're doing or what we can do better or what topics that you want to hear in the future, please let us know, and we'll try to plan around that going forward. As we mentioned, as Professor Reed mentioned as well, all of our previous webinars and a lot of other online resources are available on our YouTube channel. So if you search on YouTube for eFuture, ELT, you'll find all of these resources available to you. So including the webinars from last year, model lesson videos, if you use our books, and a lot of activity ideas that you can use with your students, right? And like I mentioned earlier, so we will be continuing our webinars going into June. The schedule is being finalized and it will be coming out very soon. So if you follow us on social media, Facebook and Instagram, they will be announced very soon. Okay, so be sure to look out for that. And we do have, going to continue to try to support all you teachers around the world as much as we can throughout the year. Everyone's circumstances are different, so we're trying our best to keep you guys supported throughout all this time. So, so all of the links are in the chat if you're looking for any of these resources that I've put here. I'll go ahead and show these emails once again. So there will be a follow-up email from Zoom for those that attended today. I will try to put the presentation link in there, so be on the lookout for that. So once again, I'd like to thank you, Professor Reed, for this very insightful webinar today. Hopefully, everyone can take in and review as well all the tips and strategies that you've given today. And I'd like to thank you guys for taking the time out one more time, and hope you all enjoy your evening and the rest of your day. And again, thank you so much, Professor Reed.